Okay, if it's okay, I'm gonna share my screen again so that we can continue to have the visual reference of the PowerPoint here, and I'll pass it over to Cheryl.
So one of the things that we wanted to do today was just to kind of share our story, let you know how our relationship started or our allyship and how it still exists today. I guess it's been about 10 years ago, maybe around
Almost
10
exactly.
years ago.
Yeah.
I attended a conference, the Circle Conference, and Jamie was presenting. And his presentation was perfect and really touched on some of the things that I was actually dealing with at work. I needed some help resolving some issues of feeling ineffective at communicating, and I knew it was bigger than my ability to communicate. And so I approached him on some of the thoughts that he was talking about and some of the issues that he was presenting. And from that, he offered to become a resource, somebody that I could talk to, somebody that would allow me to really address some of the issues that I was having in the workspace that I was in at that time. So we built this thing started on a need for me to have someone who could give me a better understanding and perspective of what I was experiencing in my work environment that I could not put words on. It was some of the power issues. It was some of the struggles that often happen in meetings when I'm presenting ideas and having to represent or justify what I'm doing, and other people around me are not having to do the same. I remember one person, I was at the time able to pick my team, and I remember a person coming who wanted to be part of my team. And in this particular work, it was clear we were serving a community that was very diverse. And this woman was a wealthy white woman wanting to come into a neighborhood that had a lot of diversity, including economic and race, and very diverse community. And it was very important to me that she had done some work before she could come in and be part of the team. And she had acknowledged that she had done some work and she was willing to do some work. She had agreed to go to the White Privilege Conference, which is another place that Jamie and I engage, and some of our work has happened. And so she had done some prerequisites that made me pretty comfortable about her coming into the space and working with us. However, one of the challenges that I found in that relationship, and I needed Jamie's help with, was that one of the things we will talk about, it became way more important for her to have a friendship. And that wasn't what this relationship was built on. And I began to struggle with finding myself extremely frustrated, trying to communicate with her what I needed from her as an ally and how I needed her to show up in the work that we were doing versus this need for a friendship. And so one of the things that I was clear at this point was that Jamie was effectively communicating some of the struggles that Jamie could communicate with her some of the struggles that we were having in a way that I couldn't. And so I reached out to him. But because the friendship for this other person was more important than the allyship, she wasn't willing to take that step. And because I needed an ally at the time and not a friend, that did not work for us. So I think that that's one of those things that we talk about is having clarity and understanding what the purpose of a relationship is. I think the other thing that happened in this relationship with Jamie and I, as we decided that we would work together, we recognized, or I'm not going to say we, Jamie had really done some work and felt like had been challenged with, actually, I think that this is something I should let Jamie tell. He's right here. You tell your piece on how you came to our split and equity in how we share work together.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I'll also just say something that I really appreciated about what Cheryl said to me that day at the Circle conference when we first connected was she was very clear with me. She said the words to me, I want to be clear, I don't need another white friend. I need you to show up for me as an ally. And what I appreciate about that is that doesn't mean that our relationship hasn't grown to be a really loving and personal relationship, like we're dancing together at my wedding, but that's because of trust we built over time, and that Cheryl was really clear with me about what she needed. And I appreciated that framing, that clarity that being an ally does not necessitate friendship. And yeah, and so when we were working together, what Cheryl was alluding to is that, I have always struggled a lot with how it makes sense for me if I'm doing professional facilitation in some way, how it makes sense for me to make money doing that as a white man, and how to do that accountably, if at all. And I still am not sure where I stand with that. I'm always kind of wrestling with it. But when Cheryl and I were being offered some contracts together, we agreed that what we thought would be an equitable way to approach it would be to recognize the fact that Black women in the United States make, the stats we were using at the time were about 69 cents for the white man's dollar. And we decided to have conversations with our clients where we reversed that, where the amount that I was being paid was 69 cents to Cheryl's dollar, not as we didn't want it to be performative. We wanted it to be a conversation about pay equity with our clients. So there wasn't just something that we were doing that was meant to address inequities in how I might get paid versus how Cheryl might get paid if we were doing this work separately, but also to try to engage our clients in thinking about how they pay their own employees. So is that kind of what you were
Yes,
referring
and
to?
I want to say that something else happened for me when we engaged in this relationship. This is one of those things that I think in an ally relationship that you're both growing and gaining, what I learned about this is that this was a really tough area for me and where oppression was showing up. I struggled with my value and what that looked like. And because of this commitment, Jamie and I, flipping the script, we not only held people outside of us to account for that, but it made me go internally and recognize how this oppressive background and this environment of space that we were working in I had internalized my own value and how I needed to really step up to asking for my worth. And so the change in how we did that, and honestly, it's, I think also we need to say is how we also split the work, made this something that I had to just sort of take a deep breath on and really say, okay, thank you. Whereas before, I came from an environment where you learn to cover your CYA, we learn to cover our asses. And secondly, we are taught that we have to be twice as good. We have to show up and we have to do twice as good for half the pay. So to be in an environment where that wasn't expected, where I was enough, where I didn't have to, and we would still do something powerful together, was it not an easy pill for me to swallow. I had learned it a whole different way. And so that's another thing that I think in a good relationship, it's going to not just be in an effective ally relationship, you will do some of your own, you will be challenged in ways that this system has oppressed you, that we walk into what becomes normative. in the way that we engage. So I could probably talk about this forever, but I just want to point out a couple of things. First of all, this is a relationship with a purpose, and that gets to be the most important thing. It requires safety. There's got to be a place for vulnerability and risk and trust. If Jamie had not done his work, I would have never approached him. He had to show up in the space as somebody who understood what his whiteness meant and how that impacted others, and that's what drew me to him. I think it's really important to understand that I pick my allies do not pick me. And in that way, I think it's an important thing to understand that you got to be showing up. If you want to gain someone's trust in this environment and to be called an ally, you don't get to call yourself that. The people who need you will call you that. And it is because you're showing up in that way. Yeah, those are the things that I wanted to make come clear out of this. Jamie, is there anything else that you want to add to how we got connected and what are the key things that have kept us strong and growing?
No, I mean, I think one thing I don't want this to seem like is like, oh, look at how great Jamie is, because, you know, we've had our struggles and I have had missteps, and it's about us building a relationship of trust over time. So I don't want it to be that as much as, you know, we're here for the Critical Race Studies and Education Association, and the ability for Black, Indigenous, and people of color folks to be able to tell counter stories that speak to their needs is why we wanted to start with Cheryl's story, recognizing that when I talk about the ways that I've tried to show up, that has come through a lot of deep learning, primarily from people who do not share my identity. Right? People in my life who are people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, people who are disabled, women, trans and non-binary folks. And so I just say that to say that it's not like, oh, yay, Jamie is doing right. It's like, this is about a process of relationship, which we're going to talk more about in a little while.
I agree.
So when we were putting this together, originally we were like, well, maybe we want to bring in more from these other frames. And we will, after the workshop, we have a number of resources we'd like to share with our participants. And so we're happy to, through the CRSEA folks, send out some links and some resources, including to these two. But these are two pieces that I think sort of take where we are starting here and keep it going, right? Offer more knowledge, more resources. And I appreciate, you know, that they're coming from two really different perspectives, from a Black queer person and from an Indigenous collective, that are offering more learning beyond what we're offering here, and also recognizing that some of what we are saying when we say ally is reflected in what they are saying. I think that one of the reasons for people trying to shift language away from ally is the way that the term has been co-opted by, often by white people or men, cisgender men, or others who are trying to claim it for themselves. And so it's a contested term, which is why I appreciate how some people are pushing toward accomplices or turncoats. And I think that we wanted to highlight these as continued learning, and also recognize that much of what these brilliant writers have put into these resources is also reflective of what we are trying to share here today. So with that in mind, we have sort of like, when we think about what it looks like, I remember one of our, and I apologize, I can't see our chat box when I'm sharing the screen, but one of them was something about tools and resources for moving things forward. I don't know if you want to share, Cheryl, how that was phrased.
Jamie,
but
you
we
broke
have
up.
9 tools or oh, I broke up. Just essentially knowing that folks are here because they want to get tools. We have 9 offerings, 9 tools, so to speak, or ways of thinking that we want folks to engage with here today. So we'll jump right into that. So the first thing, I'll start off, and then Cheryl's going to take a couple of them, is that we've talked about showing up in solidarity, whether that's about white solidarity or white allyship or other solidarity to people who are marginalized and oppressed, means that those who are trying to be in solidarity have to be in constant self-work, listening, learning, committing to self-understanding, which, you know, it sounds like anybody who's on the webinar today, that's what we're trying to accomplish. But I think the thing about that that's really important to remember is that if we're talking about racial solidarity, people of color, but for other forms of solidarity, other marginalized and oppressed folks, are not a testing ground for our ideas and actions. Like, we really need to be doing, I mean, that's not to say that we're going to have a whole thing in a little while where we talk about mistakes. That's not to say that we won't make mistakes, but it shouldn't be that we're just jumping in and trying to figure it out without spending the time to put in some work with ourselves. And something that Cheryl, when we were planning this, was really reflecting back to me is that when one has put in work to understand their own positionality, it can be obvious, and it can inspire trust, which is what sort of was part of the foundation of our relationship, is that I was just fortunate to have had a lot of really amazing mentors by the time I met Cheryl, who pushed me to think about how I was showing up in my community and in my work. And so, you know, it's about, you know, long before I should be jumping in to get involved with an organization or whatever, I also need to make sure that I'm spending some real time trying to listen and understand myself.
And
Is there
I would
anything you want
add,
to add?
yes, what I would add to that is you should have a really strong sense of who you are, why you're doing what you're doing, and how you want to show up before you're trying to engage other people or showing up for someone else. It's really important to be solid in that, because it will be tested. If you are in an effective relationship, it will be tested. And it's important to understand where you are. It's important to be able to own your mistakes. And it's important that you have a foundation on which you can grow.
Yeah, thank you for that, Cheryl. So with that in mind, we're going to spend just a little bit more time talking in small groups. I'm not exactly sure how the small groups will work, whether it'll send you back to the exact same group or if it's going to send you to different groups. But hopefully it's with the people that you've already met. And if not, then maybe we need a little time for a brief introduction. But we just want to have you all chat with one another for a minute about what the idea of doing your own work means to you. What do you feel like this looks like in your particular context and experience, knowing that each of us are bringing vastly different experiences to today's webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing for now.
Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you had an opportunity to connect within your small groups. We wanted to open up the floor to anyone who wanted to share a little bit about what your experience was in the chat room or where you are in this work under this particular topic. Feel free to unmute yourself and put your video on so we can see you, and tell us a little bit about your experience so far. Don't be shy.
Or if it would feel better, you can also put something in the chat box. But I see we have one person who's ready to share. I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take one for the team. Yeah, I never really thought that I brought much to the table. I am a first-gen, non-traditional, low-income, undocumented Latinx college student, and I never really thought that my experiences, you know, had any value or that I could support others who are going through a similar reality that I faced some time back. But now that I'm, you know, better informed, and now that I see the need for the support in this kind of work, I'm looking to create opportunities to support underrepresented students of color, especially. And, you know, through workshops, through informational items, you know, like posters or flyers, and through authentic caring with motivation, tools, and affection. So I'm actually, just last night, I got an email from some office from UCLA asking if I would be open, you know, to do another webinar regarding college transfer, especially looking to support undocumented students. So I'm of course gonna say yes, because I was just recently admitted to start a PhD at Santa Cruz. And I'm just realizing, you know, that one, not a lot of students of color get to this point, but much less students who are undocumented like myself. Lastly, I do want to mention that I am aware of some of the privileges associated with my existence, like being a cis male, being lighter skinned, even though I'm from Mexico, I am, you know, I'm the güero in the family, you know, the lighter skin, and also being bilingual. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and I'm looking to take up, you know, to create spaces and also take up space as well.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to share? Either live or in the chat box?
Thank you for inviting me to speak. So with respect to language equity in Alaska, I live in one of the 3 urban centers, if you can call them that, in Alaska. It's I live in Anchorage, and I work in world language teacher training, and I'm a Japanese language teacher. I identify as female, cis, and I'm white, but I am related to Indigenous people who are from the Athabascan community, and I work and operate on Ahtna-Dena'ina land here in Anchorage. And one thing I want to say is that I'm really concerned about the extensive funding and absolute support for world languages that Anchorage offers, excluding Indigenous languages. We have nationally recognized immersion programs K through 12 for Chinese, Japanese, I'm a part of that one, French, German, Spanish, American Sign Language. It's Russian. It's extensive and fabulous and completely inequitable with respect to Yupik language or any of the indigenous languages that are possible for my community. And so I'm here in this conference. I'm doing research work on this at University of San Francisco in a doctoral program, but I'm at this conference because I want to understand how I better enter the spaces to be an ally for my community of Indigenous students who would love to take an elective language course, but it's not even being considered. There's one tiny Yupik immersion program, which is federally funded. It's a precariously funded program because it's on a 3-year rotating grant. Nice, but completely not in balance or protected as the other languages are. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for sharing. We were actually, and speaking up, we were looking at your comments earlier and wondering how we could be supportive. And I think I'm still, go ahead, Jamie.
I was going to offer that I'm wondering if, you know, when we're going to talk a little bit about notions of creating space versus taking up space in a little bit, and I wonder if that might help us think through ways to be supportive to that particular question. Does that seem?
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate thinking about my positionality and all of this so that I can be the best kind of ally.
Yeah, thank you.
As we go through this, as people share and ideas come through, Jamie and I recognize we are not the experts on everything or many things. And so we want to make sure that if you have knowledge or expertise that you want to share, please do not hesitate to do that. That is part of how we connect, and that is part of how we can truly make change. So with that said, we're going to run through some of these things because I think we can, and we want to make space, make sure that we honor everybody's time.
I just wanted to chime in, and there's somebody who typed in something in the chat.
Okay.
From Amanda: examining the ways my body and family moves through the world and how that is based in exclusion, privilege, how my big and small choices uphold white supremacy or challenge them. Also being in process to learn about how people with different identities experience the world, to have more information on this.
Okay.
Just wanted to make sure we're honoring everybody's voice.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that. I think there's a couple of places where we can speak to that as we continue to move through this. So we will absolutely honor that. So I want to start here with understanding that ally is not an identity. I think it's a process. It's how you engage. It is the work that you do, and it is really defined by who you are engaging with and the context in which they need you to engage. Absolutely, there are times when you need to step up and be present, whether that is in activism or other times when you need to do that on your own. But when we're talking more in this kind of connection and personal spaces, whether that's in work or in your personal lives, it's a moving target. It's something that's constantly worked on, and it's constantly changing. I think that you have to step up to be something different. You grow into these places. Jamie, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, well, I think because of that, I think this is why one of the reasons people tend to be not a big fan of the term ally. And so I think whether we're using the term ally or co-conspirator or accomplice, it's recognizing that, like, you know, if we're talking about myself, like there might be one person of color or even specifically one Black person who trusts me, and another may absolutely not, based on myriad factors. And we need to recognize that because of that, we need to, it's not something we claim or that we are always, because so often this term gets used as a cudgel against people of color, but it's where it's like, but I'm your ally. It's like, no, you don't actually get to say that, right? It's about the relationship and about context.
And I think we've spoken on this quite a bit, but I will just say it again. This is a relationship with a purpose. It is not necessarily a friendship. Friendship might come as you might grow and build that, but it is very clear. I make it very clear to the allies that I choose that your allyship is way more important to me than a friendship. And if we do that well, we will develop a friendship. And so what that looks like in my world is I'm very clear that when you are in spaces that I don't get to be in, hear my voice, be my voice, speak in ways and honor me in that space that I'm not always invited in. Take responsibility and call out what's inappropriate. Don't sit back and ignore it. Those are some of the things, and I'm moving forward because these are some of the actions that we're talking about. But I think it's really to understand that this is a relationship that is bigger than, it isn't about necessarily about being a friendship. There are times when I've been with folks that I don't like, but I need them in the work that we're trying to accomplish to get things done. And that's more important than the friendship or personal feelings about what we need to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. So I'll say when Cheryl and I were first designing the PowerPoint for this, we had this framed as work to shift white people or something to that effect. But we wanted to recognize that showing up as an ally inevitably needs to happen at intersections. So it's absolutely about race, but it also will be about gender and sexual identity, about ability and disability, about citizenship status and experience. And so we decided to shift our language to recognize that some of the things that we're trying to get us to think about and engage here today are not only about showing up as a white ally, although that might be kind of how we're framing a lot of the workshop, but that they can apply in other ways. But the point here is that the people that I have, or the spaces that I have the most sway over, are ones where my identity is centered. So as a cisgender white man, there's a lot of spaces that I am centered. And it is then my responsibility to put my energies there, to put my energies toward those spaces that are white dominant and using traditionally masculine notions of leadership and other ways that I'm centered. And the important thing here is, I think one of the missteps that I've made, especially when I was younger and first trying to figure things out, is feeling like I need to immediately move into spaces of color or into other marginalized spaces because that would lend me credibility. And what I needed to understand, and I had people sometimes gently and sometimes not so gently push me to understand, is that if I'm doing that work of solidarity, if there is a need for me in those spaces, I'm going to be invited because I'm trusted. But that I need to be focused on my folks, my people. There's that saying that I know some people have tied back to W. Kamau Bell of come get your cousins. And by focusing there, I think it allows me to not only, I think, perhaps have a larger impact, but also to not take up space in spaces where I shouldn't be taking up space. And sort of the next aspect of that, and this is where I think notions of performative allyship can really show up, is that in ways that I'm trying to show up as an ally or show up in solidarity, show up as a co-conspirator, what have you, it's in part, among other things, my work to guide fellow white folks or men or others who share my identity into spaces of discomfort. I think back to something that a mentor of mine, his name is Dr. James Logan, many years ago really pushed me to remember, is he's like, Jamie, if you ever get to a place in your work trying to work for justice where you find yourself feeling quite comfortable, it's time for you to change something, because growth doesn't happen in spaces of comfort. Growth happens in spaces of discomfort. And so that's when I need to push myself to learn more or do more. And within that, I want to just speak briefly about the notion of call-outs versus call-ins. And I think in particular, I'm noticing white folks in common discourse right now being really upset with the notion of cancel culture. And I think legitimately there are conversations within movements that we should have about disposability and how disposability recreates sort of imprisonment mindsets or carceral mindsets. But generally, I'm uncomfortable with the fact that we have now almost put a moral judgment on a call out versus a call in, because they're both tools that should be used. Sometimes a call out is necessary. Like, for instance, something that Cheryl and I have talked a lot about, and I've had a number of people who don't share my identity name, is that anytime that there is a public harm, there needs to be a public response. And a public response doesn't necessarily lend itself to call in all the time. It might just be naming, hey, I just want to name that that language was really harmful, and we can come back to that. But naming it in a public way might be the call out, or naming in some way that action or that language was harmful needs to be public, because to do it privately through perhaps a call-in protects the ego of the person who did the harm at the expense of the person who was harmed, because then there's perhaps no public acknowledgement of the harm that was caused. And so to me, guiding my cousins, my folks, into discomfort is about being willing to be uncomfortable myself, and also recognizing that, like, I have to, I mean, there are times when I can get to a place with a fellow white person where I'm like, this is not the best use of my energy to just be like banging my head up against the wall of my super racist uncle's ideologies. But I have a responsibility, I believe, to at least try to guide folks in my life into those spaces of discomfort. And sometimes that means a call out, sometimes that means a call in. And I can decide later that that's not the best use of my energy to keep working with somebody who does not have an interest in trying to be less harmful, for instance, to people of color or to trans people or what have you. But the point is that I have to be willing to put in that work. And that means I need to develop tools. I need to think through what is, for any given person, what is going to be, or any given organization or whatever it might be, what is going to be the most effective tool to guide folks into that space of growth that comes in discomfort. For those who are educators, we talk about the zone of proximal development, that in that space where one is somewhat uncomfortable, but not so uncomfortable that they shut down and stop paying attention to the math concept or whatever it is we're trying to teach. The same is true here. Like, we need to find ways to help shift people, because I need to recognize that the person that, you know, I've had times where I come back 10 years later to somebody who shares my identity, who really pushed me, to apologize and be like, hey, yeah, you know what, I realize now you are absolutely right. It took me a while to come around. I appreciate you're pushing me to think about prison abolition and police abolition rather than reform or whatever it might be. So do you have anything you want to chime in with, Cheryl, before?
I think that in our recent environment and with some of the challenges that our country has faced, I've been asked to speak on panels, and I've been asked to show up in ways that I've shown up in the past. And I have made it very clear that I will not do that anymore. And so instead, what I have said to some of the people in my industry that ask for my help on things that we have done that look like they've looked in the past, my statement is, that's not how I'm showing up anymore. I am not going to put my emotion on display for white people's benefits anymore. But what I will do is I will help you with what you want to say. I will help and review what you want to change. I will not do it for you. I will not show up that way. And if you ask for my time, I expect to be paid in some kind of way. I've not always been able to say that. And so one of the things that I have taken on in the way that I want to show up and ask in the work environments that I'm being asked to show up in as a woman of color, for my knowledge and experience, is making sure that the folks that are asking me are willing to show up. I'm intentionally making it, I'm not taking on all the responsibility, which before I would have, or not all of it, but a lot more of it. And I would be more quiet about that. I'm actually calling that out now. And I am asking that the folks who want to work with me have to show up and step up differently. And so I think that's an example of how we can see it in the workplace now. And asking people to, and this sort of fits in as an example of one of the things we'll talk about in a little bit. But I think that this is part of that process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Cheryl.
And I think this is the example that I was trying to, in the example that I just gave, talking about this solidarity piece, it's very much about risk. I found myself oftentimes needing to speak up or wanting to speak up or not wanting to speak up, but not willing to let it go, recognizing that what I need to say or what needs to be said could cost me my job. What needs to happen here is going to make people uncomfortable, and I may not be invited back. I am expecting the people who call themselves my allies to do the same. I want them to show up. I want them to take risk. I want them to be the leaders and the voices in the communities that we are talking about making change in, to show up with that risk, knowing that they might get hateful emails for what they're saying, or somebody may decide that they are not going to invite them back to the table because they don't like what they just said or their commitment to the work that needs to be done, but they're willing to do it anyway. They're willing to find another funder. They're willing to do it in a way that is different so that we can truly make impact and change. And that doesn't happen without taking risk. You have to get uncomfortable. You have to put it out there. And for many of us as people of color, that's just been a way of life. It's not the choice is we close in on ourselves through the oppression to sustain our well-being, or we risk losing our jobs, and oftentimes we do. And so we are asking that folks that are calling themselves allies or accomplices to be willing to do the same. So I think that that's to understand that you can't do this without taking some risk.
Mm-hmm. And I'll offer one quick thing about the point of people having, like, risk might look different for different positionalities. Is I'm thinking about, you know, a drum that I feel like I bang on a lot with people in my life is that when we're deciding, especially people who are white, when we're deciding, for instance, that it's time that we're gonna donate because of feeling intense feelings around, say, the killing of George Floyd, if we're gonna donate to organizations, thinking about which organizations to make sure that they're actually people of color led. And beyond that, though, to donate in an amount that is uncomfortable and to set it as a recurring donation. And I say that because there's one person who is in my social media sphere who every time I say that, who's a white man, he private messages me with, like, frustration that he feels like I'm telling him he's not doing enough if he's not giving in an amount that's uncomfortable. And he's like, he in the work that he does, he doesn't make a lot of money. And at the same time, because of intergenerational wealth and land theft, he owns his home, or like a bank owns his home, but he pays the bank instead of renting. And we had to talk through, I'm not saying that the amount that is risky for him should be the same amount that I'm giving, right? It's about what is my positionality, so that I can show up in a way that feels hard, that's challenging, that stretches me because of the risk involved.
So before we do this next breakout, I would really like to just check in with the room. Does anybody have any questions, or this is a good place for us to sort of unpack some of the things we've talked about up to this point? Does anybody need clarity on any of the points we've covered thus far?
While folks are gathering their thoughts, I'll just briefly share what came up in the chat. So from Tammy, I hope to someday become faculty, and I wonder how I can be an accomplice and support colleagues of color without talking for them, and for is in all caps. There's emphasis there. And then Betsy chimed in and said that when you were explaining, how to, to answer the question, and she says, that sounds right.
Okay. I want to chime in in the school environments. This is one I've had the opportunity to be engaged with school a lot because, first of all, my kids are there, and I've always had a commitment to volunteer where they are. But secondly, I've been blessed to be able to work in that environment as well. And I will say this. I think in the school environments, more than anything, we really need to support our educators of color, especially if they are not the predominant folks. And places that looks, and one of the ways that I have advised my colleagues of color in those environments is to train their allies on how to support them. So for example, there was an activity that came up, I remember it was for a conference for girls of color to attend. And so there's only, in this particular school environment, there were only 2 people of color that were teachers and only 1 that was female. And so there was an assumption that she was going to take on this project. And so people began to direct questions to her. They began to refer the students to her automatically. And that's just not how it should be. And so she got to the point where she was, first of all, extremely frustrated that was happening. But she was also frustrated that none of her colleagues or the people who call themselves friends or showing up to her were supporting her in that. So I think that one of the ways is really making sure that the work is equitable, that we get choice if we want to speak to something. I think taking on some of the responsibilities, thinking about what it looks like, and how it's handled when quote unquote issues that affect people of color are handled in your environment. Who are the experts? Who's considered the experts? And how is that handled? Typically what that has looked like in the environments that I've been in is that it becomes your people of color that are the experts. And that translates to more work on their plate. They're expected to speak to that, take on more responsibility, including questions among the staff that they should be researching and asking themselves. So I think there's a lot of ways to show up in schools and helping in those environments. If anybody else wants to chime in on that, I'd love to hear some other thoughts around that.
Also offer that in a minute, I mean, I know we're running out of time, but in a minute we have a section where Cheryl's going to speak to the notion of what it means to create space or to make space. And I think what I'm hearing in a lot of what Cheryl is naming here is that part of showing up and not speaking for, but creating the kind of environment where people can speak up is about different types of creation of space. And I appreciate that, if in a minute, hopefully Cheryl can share a little bit, but she really pushed me to think about making space has to look different in different types of environments. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, Cheryl, how you feel, knowing that we have a couple more discussions where we wanted them to break out, if leaving this particular breakout as about taking risk as one for people to reflect on for themselves. What does taking risk look like for you? So that then they can talk more about making space in just a minute, which is what that question kind of comes back around to. Does that seem okay, Cheryl?
Absolutely. I know we're...
Cool. I'll keep this one short so that then we can get to the point about making space. But in order to show up in solidarity, one cannot be doing it from a place of paternalism, where it's like, well, I feel so sad about the experience that Black people have in this country, or about land theft from Indigenous people, and so I want to help bring voice to the voiceless, or something, right? Like some tried phrase like that. And I think the point, and this is something that I still am involving so much in, but I've had people push me hardest on, is when I was trying to show up as an ally, it was most obvious when I was doing it from that place of let me help you, instead of that idea that I understand what my own skin in the game is, what my personal investment in realizing collective liberation is, not only for people that I love, right, but also for myself, for my own liberation from the ways that whiteness is a toxic thing that harms people in our society, including me, or the way that patriarchy and masculinity are toxic things that harm. And I can't compare the harm that I experience to the harm of those who are targeted by systems of oppression, but to recognize that it doesn't have to mean that I'm comparing that in order for me to understand my own emotional investment in collective liberation. So with that, this is where I wanted us to get to, knowing that that question was really about this. Cheryl, I'll let you talk a little bit about, because when we were talking in preparation, the way that you really framed this helped me a ton.
So I think that when we talk about making space, it can look different. So in most of the environments where I've worked in, space often means there's only one person. Oftentimes there's only one person of color. So in my mind, when we talk about making space, we want to grow. We want to create and acknowledge that that's not the way it should be. So we want to begin to change our spaces in those work environments that we're in to expand, to include people of color. We want to make sure that there's space for voice, and sometimes that space, when I think about the groups that I have involved in, and when I think about the teams that I have led, what is important to me is not always that we have a majority of people involved, as much as it is that every voice at the table is represented. So we will sometimes back off of something so that the expertise that is represented around this space, everyone can see themselves in the project or our final product. So that every voice is heard, that we are engaging, and that what we produce is representative of everyone, not just a few folks in this space. And so I think that when we talk about making space, we need to be intentional to honor the knowledge and experience that may not be what is considered traditional in the environments that we are in. And I think it also means exercising and giving choice to where we want to show up and how we can best show up. Oftentimes we are pushed into situations because other people have defined that for us, as opposed to really allowing our expertise and knowledge of life experience and how we have to navigate the world differently to have value in the environments we're in. We need to make room for that, especially since now the goal, at least much of the world, or many people in the world, are talking about trying to right some of these wrongs. If we don't change how we are engaging, if we do not change how we are showing up, the changes aren't going to happen permanently. And I will say one of the other things that I've been really intentional about in my work is really calling people out on what whiteness looks like. I don't fully know what that means. I know what it looks like as a woman of color to have to go up against this, but there is power in whiteness language in these systemic systems. So I am asking people to define that, and I am asking them to look at the work that they are producing and recognize it, and then change it. And so when people are asking me to, in these relationships that I'm working in and being invited to come back into, I'm calling out that kind of thing. I'm asking that we need to be more intentional about that. If you don't see the changes that you want, then you need to see how ingrained the issues are that you are trying to change that aren't changing. So making space can mean, I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Jamie. No, I'm done. Go ahead.
I was going to say something that I remember Eddie Moore Jr. often says at the White Privilege Conference. He's the founder of the Privilege Institute. And he talks about how, a black seed cannot grow in the soil of whiteness, that white soil is toxic to everything other than the growth and the development of white people. So if we're not able to name and then address the toxicity of the environments that are rooted in whiteness, it makes it a lot harder for us to even begin to make space for marginalized, oppressed people to be present and not feel alone, because folks aren't going to be able to thrive, right? Live into their full selves. And I often come back to that idea when I hear you talking about addressing how whiteness is operative. I think back to that idea from Dr. Moore that we need to deal with that if we're going to address space. Like, it's not enough. Like, if we're in a faculty role, it's not enough to make minor changes. We have to really rethink the ways that our systems are structured for the benefit of white people at the expense of everyone else. I'm wondering, I know I want to respect folks' time, and we are out of time for the time that we had set aside, but I also appreciate that Kathy had named that there's a buffer for those who are trying to attend the next workshop. There is a buffer. So I wonder if, Cheryl, what you think about me naming the thing about mistakes briefly.
Yes.
And then sending them into their small groups for the closing breakout, because they can, as part of the closing breakout, they can talk about how they're going to make space, which is the next breakout. I don't know how you feel about that. And then if folks have to get off, I completely understand.
Absolutely.
Does that seem okay? All right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm gonna briefly talk about this just because I want to make sure we say it. It's really, I think, an important closing point. And then for anybody who's able to stay on the call, we'll give you a few minutes in a closing breakout to talk with one another. But I think one of the most important aspects of trying to be in solidarity is to recognize something that a mentor told me when I was about 18 years old. In her words, who's a Latinx woman, she said, Jamie, if you're gonna start down this road of trying to act in solidarity, you're gonna fuck up. And you're going to do it often. And what you do after you mess up is what actually will determine whether or not you are an ally to anyone. And sort of through that and other experiences I've had along the way, I've gotten this clear message that, so knowing that we are going to make mistakes, what that means is that then when we make mistakes, we have to listen, and we have to be very careful not to be defensive and passive aggressive when we are listening, to accountably apologize, not apologizing with the "I'm sorry you felt offended" BS. This next piece, I think, is the one that often gets left off when people apologize for doing harm, is then enact reparations. Ask that person, what does it look like for me to offer some degree of reparations for any harm that I have done, and work really, really hard to enact that reparation. And then work to never make that same mistake, knowing that too often the learning that people of any form of privilege has, that's the deepest learning, comes when we do harm to other people, right? We learn, and that's not okay. It's not okay. So A, we need to enact reparations, and B, we need to make sure that we're not continually over and over and over again causing that same harm. And really truly work to listen so that we make sure we are aware of the harm that we are creating, that we're apologizing for it, and enacting reparations. And so I'll try to make this a very, very brief story because it's relevant to my relationship with Cheryl. And I know we're over time now, but something that really drove this home for me is that a number of years ago, I was trying to act in solidarity to a Black woman in my life who I cared a lot about, who my understanding of their situation was that they were being pushed out of their employment, in large part because they were making waves about whiteness and white supremacy and patriarchy and cis heteronormativity and others. And I got so upset when I heard that she was being pushed out of her employment, and I'm connected to a lot of people at the institution where she was employed, that without pausing and breathing and asking her what she might want, I shot off an email to a whole bunch of people saying, this is unacceptable, this is happening, what are we gonna do about it, how are we gonna act, right? So I was acting without reflecting, acting without making sure that that was what actually was needed. And in doing so, I put that woman's job position at more risk than she was before because of my actions, right? And in that, I listened to the harm and I apologized. And it was really hard for me that what reparations for her was like, we're not going to be in a relationship anymore. Because we've been in a relationship for a long time at that point, and I care about them. She's like, there are other things that she asked me to do as well, but that we're not going to be in a relationship anymore. And she said, I need you to make sure that the people in your life who you're trying to act in solidarity with know what you did here, so that they can choose whether or not they're going to continue trusting you. And so, because that's what she asked of me, I reached out to a number of people, Cheryl being one of them. And Cheryl and I remember this very, very well. We were walking kind of in downtown Denver area, and I was sharing with her what happened, with the complete understanding that this might sever my relationship with Cheryl, who I care really deeply about. And that would be a completely understandable reaction if that were the reaction that she had. But that was the reparation that was asked of me. And I'm fortunate that Cheryl understood that in a way that allowed us to continue to be in relationship. And I don't want to speak for you if you want to say anything about that. But the point was that I needed to then make really sure that I was not committing that kind of harm again.
I remember this conversation, and my question to Jamie was, well, did you learn from your mistake? Mm. And he answered he did. And for me, that was enough. That was enough for us to continue and to move forward. So I think those are the other things that we need to, I think this is a beautiful example of understanding that mistakes will be made. And some of them will cost you the relationship, but that is not an excuse to stop the work.
Mm-hmm. And it might cost you more than that. It could cost you a job. It could cost you other things. And that doesn't mean that it should stop the work. Absolutely.
The work, as we stated earlier, has to be bigger than the relationship.
Mm-hmm. So knowing that we're about out of time, I think that our closing breakout might be something that that if folks have time, I don't know how many folks are still on the call, but if folks have time and would like to, we can send folks one more time back into their rooms to just talk about and identify one thing that you will commit to doing or changing to realize more accountable solidarity based on this webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. If I can figure out where that went. There it is.
And everybody's going into their breakout rooms now.
Wonderful, thanks.
Defining how you want to show up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would love it if you want to speak to that. I think that's an important point.
All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just want to chime in on a comment on Facebook from Jessica. Jessica says, wow, I appreciate this story. It helps me understand why I have felt the same way about folks who have attempted to function as allies and mentors for me. It's created more harm or stress for me, even when their intentions are good.
Mhm, mhm. Thank you for that comment. And I think that there's a comment in the chat box that I think sort of supports that too. And this it says, I hope to someday become faculty, and I wonder how I can be an accomplice and support colleagues of color without talking for them. I think that goes back to what we spoke to earlier, and that is finding your own voice. If you are connected, if you've done your research, if you've checked into your heart and what drives you and why you're committed to the work, you will find a way to speak to what is happening around you that is about your knowledge, your expertise, and your commitment. It doesn't have to be for someone else's. If you find yourself speaking for someone, that means you're disconnected. Mm. And you need to be effective in this work. You need to be connected. You have to have skin in the game. You have to be connected. And so if you're finding folks that are doing that, I would encourage you to ask them to be more reflective and to look at themselves. There's so much work to be done that there is not a need to speak for someone else. There's a way that you can speak for what you're experiencing and what you see not showing up as a lack in the environments that you are to make a difference. So thank you. Thank you, everybody, for taking and being here with us, for taking the risk, for learning, for engaging with each other, and for what you will take and use from this time we've spent together. To really make a difference, this has to be more than a thought, it needs to be an action. So I want to encourage you to do that. We hope that you have connected with someone who can help you be accountable for the commitment that you're making. And if you didn't, please try to do that after this. We thank you for staying in a little later. We're sorry we ran over time, but we absolutely want to encourage those of you who want to stay on and take a few minutes more to engage. Kathy is going to talk to you guys about other things that are coming on. If you have anything else that you want to put in the chat box, please take a minute to do that. And we will share resources via email after this, later, after the event.
I want to thank Kathy. I was just going to say, I want to thank Kathy and the CRSEA team for all of the work that they are putting in for this webinar series. And I want to thank my co-facilitator, Cheryl, for all of the hard work that you put in to work with me. And thank you for trusting me.
Oh, absolutely.
And I want to thank both of you for conducting this very important session. You know, I know for some of us, it can be a little uncomfortable, but you know, if we're not feeling uncomfortable, then we're not making progress. And I want to thank all of our folks who stayed in. I know we're over time, but we do have another session coming up in about 45 minutes. And that is titled Bridging the Digital Divide of Distance Learning for Students of Color. And that will be facilitated by Profesora Yolanda Varela Gonzalez. If y'all can join us for that. You can join us on Facebook Live, or you can register and get the Zoom link. Keep in mind that if you do try to join our Facebook group, you will have to answer membership questions. I've seen a lot of membership requests who aren't answering the questions. So please answer the questions yourself. And if you're inviting folks to the group, please make sure that they answer the questions. And that's just to, you know, weed out any people who aren't intentional in being in this sort of group. All right, thank you so much and have a great afternoon.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
So
I'm going to stop recording and I'm going to turn off the live stream.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.